In the winter of 1943, inside a frozen ruin that used to be a city, a German general did something no officer in Hitler's army was ever supposed to do. He stopped believing. Not in the war. Not in the men standing beside him. He stopped believing in the one man he had sworn his life to, Adolf Hitler. And what he did next isn't in most textbooks. It isn't in the documentaries you've already watched about Stalingrad, or the fall of Berlin, or the final days in the bunker. Because what this man did was worse than losing, worse than surrendering. He helped build an army, made of German soldiers, to fight against Germany. Not partisans. Not resistance fighters hiding in the hills. Trained Wehrmacht officers, decorated veterans, men who had bled for the Reich, now working to turn their own comrades against the government that sent them to die. This is the story Hitler didn't want told. High Command tried to bury it. Propaganda ministers spun it into a ghost story to scare their own men. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why they were so afraid of it. His name was Walther von Seydlitz-Gersbach, and on paper, he was everything the Third Reich claimed to want in a general. Old Prussian nobility, going back generations. A direct descendant of a legendary commander who once served under Frederick the Great, a name that carried weight in the German officer corps long before the Nazis ever existed. Decorated, disciplined, methodical. By 1942, he was one of the most trusted corps commanders on the entire Eastern Front. He had already proven himself where it mattered most, at the Damayansk pocket, breaking a Soviet encirclement that should have wiped out his men, earning the Knight's Cross for pulling off what looked impossible. To his superiors, Seydlitz wasn't just another loyal officer following orders. He was reliable. The kind of general you handed a collapsing situation to, trusting he'd find a way through it. Which is exactly why what happened to him next mattered so much. Because the next impossible situation he was handed had no way through it at all. By November 1942, Seydlitz's corps was one piece of the German Sixth Army, dug into the ruins of Stalingrad as Soviet forces slammed shut around them in Operation Uranus. Nearly 300,000 men, sealed inside a shrinking pocket, running out of fuel, ammunition, and food a little more every single day. Seydlitz did what any competent commander does the moment the math stops working. He asked to break out. Immediately. While there was still a window to save the men under his command. Hitler said no. Not once, repeatedly. A breakout would look like a retreat, and retreat wasn't a word that existed in Hitler's vocabulary anymore, not after the humiliations of the previous winter. So the man actually in command of the Sixth Army, General Friedrich Paulus, followed his Führer's orders instead of the warnings coming from his own subordinate. Seydlitz watched his soldiers die for a decision he knew, with total certainty, was wrong. Not because the Soviets outfought them, because his own side was too stubborn to admit the position was already lost. And something in him didn't just crack under that pressure. It flipped completely. When what remained of the Sixth Army finally surrendered in February 1943, Seydlitz marched into Soviet captivity alongside 90,000 starving, frostbitten men, the survivors of an army that had numbered in the hundreds of thousands only weeks earlier. For most German officers captured that day, that was the end of their story. A prison camp. Years of silence. Maybe a quiet memoir decades later, if they lived that long. For Seydlitz, captivity was only the beginning of something the Nazi high command could never have imagined in their worst nightmares. Most channels covering this era stop the story right here. Captured general, somber music, cut to the next battle. But Seydlitz didn't sit quietly in that camp waiting out the war. He started talking, to his captors, to Soviet officials, to anyone who would listen, about Hitler, about the war, about what he had personally watched happen to his own men because one man in a bunker refused to admit he could ever lose. The Soviets noticed immediately, and they recognized an opportunity almost too good to be true. If they could turn a decorated Prussian general, a man with genuine credibility inside the German officer corps, not some disgraced nobody, into a public voice against Hitler, it wouldn't just be another piece of wartime propaganda. It would be devastating. It would send one message to every exhausted German soldier still fighting on the front. Even your own generals think this war is madness. So in July 1943, something formed that Berlin would spend the rest of the war pretending didn't exist. The National Committee for a Free Germany. And Seydlitz didn't just quietly support it from the sidelines the way some captured officers did to survive. He stepped up and became its vice president, putting his name, his rank, and his reputation directly behind an organization built to dismantle the government he had served his entire adult life. This wasn't a handful of bitter prisoners grumbling quietly in a barracks somewhere in Siberia. This was an organized political and military movement, run by former Wehrmacht officers, backed with full Soviet resources, whose entire purpose was to turn German soldiers, and eventually the German civilian population, against their own leadership. It had a newspaper distributed across occupied territory. It had radio broadcasts, beamed across the front lines in fluent German, urging exhausted soldiers to lay down their weapons and stop dying for a man who was marching them straight into a mass grave. And it had an actual military wing, the League of German Officers, made up of men who, in almost any other version of this war, would have been leading panzer columns against the Red Army instead of standing beside it. Nazi propaganda knew exactly how dangerous this was, and gave it a name soaked in fear before it could spread on its own terms: the Seydlitz troops. The idea alone was enough to unsettle German command at the front. Because if it was real, if there really were columns of German soldiers, in German uniforms, fighting for the Soviet side, how could any commander trust that the men approaching his position in the dark weren't the enemy in disguise? How do you defend a line when you can no longer be certain who's actually on it? That fear did more damage to German morale than the actual battlefield numbers ever could. Here's the part that makes this story genuinely uncensored and not just a dramatized legend. Historians still argue today about how real the military side of the Seydlitz troops actually was. Some believe it functioned mostly as psychological warfare, a handful of small infiltration teams slipping back across the lines in old Wehrmacht uniforms to spread confusion and paranoia, rather than a genuine fighting force charging into open battle against German troops. Seydlitz himself reportedly wanted far more than that. He believed he could raise tens of thousands of volunteers from the German prisoners sitting in Soviet camps, a real German liberation army, fighting shoulder to shoulder with the Red Army against the regime he'd abandoned. But Moscow never fully trusted the idea. Too many unknowns. Too many potential double agents slipping back through. Too much uncertainty about where those soldiers' loyalty would actually land the moment they crossed back into German-held territory with a weapon in their hands. So what physically crossed those lines was almost certainly smaller than the legend suggests. But the fear it created among German ranks was enormous regardless. And that's the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of this entire story. Sometimes a psychological weapon does more damage to an army than an actual invading force ever could. Seydlitz never got the ending either side of this war would have scripted for him. Germany branded him a traitor. His name became a warning inside a regime obsessed with total, unquestioning loyalty until the very last bullet. Proof of what weakness looked like when it wore a general's uniform. But the Soviets didn't reward him with gratitude either. After the war ended, he was tried and convicted of war crimes by the very government he had chosen to side with, and spent years afterward in Soviet custody before finally being released in the mid-1950s, decades after the war that defined him had ended. He died in 1976, not remembered as a hero by either country, and not quite the simple villain Nazi propaganda tried to paint either. Something stranger than both. A man who looked directly at the machine he had sworn his life to serve, watched it grind his own soldiers into the frozen ground for absolutely nothing, and decided that loyalty had a limit after all. Most soldiers who reached that exact same realization never had the rank, the platform, or the nerve to actually act on it. He did. The bigger picture. Visual, pull back to full Eastern Front map, fading into black and white archival footage. By the war's final year, Hitler was moving armies that no longer existed across maps inside his own bunker, refusing to accept a reality his commanders had already accepted months earlier. Seydlitz had watched that exact same refusal to face the truth years before at Stalingrad. And unlike so many officers who simply stayed silent until the end, he chose to become the one thing the Reich feared most rising from inside its own ranks. A German soldier who decided the real enemy was no longer standing across the front line. It was the man giving the orders from behind it. Closing hook/CTA. Visual, final still of Seydlitz. Text overlay with his dates. Fade to channel logo. So the next time someone tells you every German general stood loyally beside Hitler until the very last day, remember that one of the most decorated men in his entire army looked at exactly what that loyalty was costing his soldiers and chose betrayal instead. If you want the next Uncensored story the algorithm doesn't want surfaced, hit subscribe, because next time, we're going even deeper into the unit's World War II history tried its hardest to erase. End card. Cut to black.